Welcome back, everybody. We're now moving into part 3 of our series on gospel-grounded ministry to sexual minorities. And this part is about what we're calling restoration sexuality. And we're going to open this up by talking about the false choice in this binary between pride and shame. And there are ways we often get stuck in earthly, worldly, or even, as we call here, demonic thinking that sexual minorities can believe they're facing, where they feel like they have to choose between pride and shame. So we're going to talk about in this first section on how we transcend pride and shame through gospel teachings on the way the gospel views identity and change. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. This is part 3 of our presentation on gospel-grounded ministry to sexual minorities. And today we're going to enter part 3, which we're calling the restoration model of sexuality. And we contrast it with two, and this, I know this is a harsh word, but I stand by it, two alternate demonic systems that we're usually stuck in. And I'll also say this presentation is maybe the most hands-on. This will be of use to, most use to the person who is themselves a sexual minority. But I think, Dan, you can also affirm that really anybody who has any kind of sexuality will find a lot of this relatable and useful and helpful.
Yeah, the principles here they're very broadly applicable no matter what your situation.
Yeah. So these two demonic systems are shame and pride. And I call them demonic because Satan is the author of both of these. Pride we see in the premortal world, where Satan said, "My will, not thine." And we can see it with sexuality in the world today. You know, whenever a beautiful actress does a nude scene in a movie, we say, "Oh, that's brave. That's so brave. That's so," again, we'll turn that sexuality, that exploitation and objectification into this thing we're going to celebrate. And there's a great example of pride, right? If you've got it, flaunt it. And then later on in the garden, we see another case where Satan introduced shame into the world. He was the one that told Adam and Eve they were naked and told them to be ashamed of that. And so often we flip between these two extremes. And there's a great C.S. Lewis quote that Dan gave me that says this: "I feel a strong desire to tell you, and I expect you feel a strong desire to tell me which of these two errors is worse." He's not actually talking about shame and pride, but he could be. That is the devil getting at us. He always sends errors into the world in pairs of opposites, right? Shame and pride are the opposite, right? So pick one. Nope. He always encourages us to spend a lot of time thinking which is worse. You can see why, of course. He relies on your extra dislike of the one error to draw you gradually into the opposite one. But do not let us be fooled. We have to keep our eyes on the goal and go straight through between both errors. We have no other concern than that with either of them. So pride isn't the answer and shame isn't the answer.
Yeah, the lie here is that there's only two possible ways of approaching your experience, and that is either shame or pride.
Mm-hmm. In fact, can we say, let's offer one of the first of several heuristics we're going to offer in this part of our series. And a heuristic, that's a big fancy word, and apologize if any of you got heartburn over that, but it just means a tool of thinking or a way of thinking, right, Dan? It's just a thinking tool. And so anytime you feel like you're stuck between two bad choices, between a rock and a hard place, may I suggest you consider that it's the adversary wanting you to feel like you don't have a choice, that there is no other way. There probably is another way that you're just not seeing. and God is going to invite you. And it's also sometimes we think, all right, we're not going to think binary thinking. There's an extreme. So let's be halfway shameful and halfway prideful. Let's be somewhere right here, balanced right in the middle. That's also not what we're trying to do. We want to rise above this. We want to rise above. I've got this nice gradient picture. So we want to come up here. And so we rise above the worldly and go to a more heavenly, more restoration type model. And I call this pinnacle humility, or you can call it gratitude. And it recognizes that specifically when we're talking about sexuality, we talked last time, previously in the series, about how sexuality has a telos, or a purpose. And in the restoration model, in God's design for our sexuality, the purpose of sexuality is to unite the male and the female in the sacred bonds of marriage for the purposes of creating children and strengthening that marital bond. And you'll notice that you do not have a complete, whether you're a man or a woman, you do not have a complete reproductive system. Your circulatory system has your lung and your heart, and they have to work together. If they don't work together, you're dead. Doesn't matter if your lungs working and your heart isn't, or vice versa. You don't have a functioning circulatory system if you don't have both of those. Likewise, if you don't have the male and the female coming together, you don't have reproduction. And so what God's design, that this heavenly restoration model says, is that sexuality, the purpose of sexuality is for this, but it's not yours. Yes, we have stewardship over our sexuality, but it is to be humbly used for God's purposes and God's glory and God's design. It's a stewardship that we employ, but it is not ours. It is meant to be paired with someone else's in that sacred bond. Anything to add there, Dan?
No, I would just say the humility, when you transcend shame and pride and you say there's another option, there's another set of possibilities beyond this false binary of shame and pride. Humility is what it's going to do is just open you up to more possibilities. We're not saying just think of humility as the destination. Humility is what creates space for all kinds of things that God wants to offer you. And that goes for all of us. Right. So, transcending that shame and pride binary, if you can just get into that zone of humility, that's where you have the fertile soil for God to grow some really fruitful and wonderful things in your life.
And we're going to talk later about Doctrine and Covenants 59 in this section. But remember, it says, in nothing doth man offend God more than he confess not his hand in all things. So gratitude is confessing God's hand and inviting God into our lives and being able to recognize God in our lives. And that requires humility. So gratitude and humility really go hand in hand. That's why I really can't pick between those two. But it's being grateful in any circumstance, as President Uchtdorf taught us.
Yep.
So specifically, when it comes to sexuality, this is titled the restoration model. And so contrasting that is what I call the pride embrace model on one hand, and then the other one we'll talk about in just a sec. And in this model, here are some characteristics of this model, this philosophy. And let me just say at the outset, both of these, pride model and the shame model, have some truth in them. They have some appeal. If they didn't, they wouldn't be so popular. So I don't want to criticize this in its entirety, but I do want to describe what I believe are the components of it. So in a committed relationship, though that's not usually emphasized, there's nothing wrong with homosexual behavior. It's not sinful, according to this pride embrace model. And in fact, any form of sexual expression or behavior are equally good. And one isn't better than the other. All the varieties are not just equal or not bad, they're good. All these sexual differences are to be celebrated and considered good, so long as they're consensual, though that gets a little fuzzy sometimes. Consensual for who? As we're seeing the whole Me Too movement, that isn't quite as straightforward as it seems all the time. You'll hear same-sex couples are exactly the same as opposite-sex couples in every respect. As we talked earlier in the series, homosexuality is innate and unchangeable. And it's harmful to ask or expect people to restrain their sexual expression if this is who they are. And we see this, by the way, bleeding out. Why this applies to more than just sexual minorities is we're seeing this now with polyamory. You'll hear people say this, oh, I can't be happy with just one woman. And it was harmful for me to try to confine my sexual expression to just one woman. And from this model, they're absolutely correct. There's no reason why only sexual minorities should have this difficulty. There's a lot of other people who are harmed because they can't express their sexuality the way they want to, the way they desire. And that goes back to the essentialist idea we covered earlier too, right? If your sexual proclivities, if the kind of sexuality that you desire to express, or put it more strongly, yearn to express, is core part of your being, which is what the essentialist model does, then yes, by not acting on those, you are denying who you are. And if you're denying who you are, you aren't being authentic. Likewise, there's a slogan you may have heard: gay people are born perfect. You're born perfect. And therefore, nothing needs to change about gay people at all. And even though it's innate and unchangeable, it's nevertheless something to celebrate and have pride in. And while on one level that seems illogical, on another level it doesn't. If you're coming out of shame, if you've been imprisoned in this shame, if you've felt bad about yourself because of this, then you're really having pride and celebration, not so much in this innate immutable characteristic, but in the fact that you can now acknowledge it openly, in the fact that you've now accepted it. But that's just another extreme that you can go to that is also not very helpful. In the pride embrace model, any problems that you'll see with gay people or in the gay community are solely due to homophobia, repression, minority stress, and or the failure of the church or church members, church leaders to accept and embrace homosexual behavior in gay couples. Any mental health differences, any health differences, any other differences we might see that are negative are because of lack of societal acceptance. And a similar related proposition is, if homophobia disappeared entirely and the church would just accept homosexual behavior, then gays' mental health would dramatically improve and their suffering would be eliminated. So we see what happens, how this kind of sets up a conflict, right? So whenever church leaders might criticize homosexual behavior or call it a sin, this is going to be seen as harmful by people in the pride embrace model. If they talk about, say, gender confusion, they're going to be upset because they don't feel very confused. Though I'd invite anybody to look in the definition of confusion. It also means to conflate or combine in ways that muddy distinctions. So it doesn't necessarily mean someone doesn't understand or confused, but it's talking about muddying differences or confusing, to confuse something. It may be also what they're referring to here. And so anybody then wants to, and we'll talk about this in the next when we talk about ministry, that's then all of a sudden sexual minorities are victims. They're victims of this exclusionary, hateful, hurtful rhetoric, and then we want to leap to their defense. But there's some people who feel, and they're sincere, that if the church would just do this, that gay people wouldn't have any suffering whatsoever, which would come as a surprise to exclusively heterosexual people who do still suffer, but somehow all of the suffering that gay people have is because of this.
And Jeff, I would just, I don't want to go on too big of a tangent here, but I would ask listeners to remember a phrase, and that's locus of control.
Yes.
And in mental health discussions, if you have an external locus of control, that means that your perception of your happiness, it depends on things external to you, other things happening outside of you, other people doing things differently, institutions doing things differently. And it is a recipe for misery if you have an external locus of control. So these narratives actually feed an external locus of control among people who adhere to them.
Yeah. And you can see that with the pride model. There's a lot of things wrong with the world, but nothing wrong with sexual minorities.
Right.
And shame models may be even worse, because this one says, I just suck. I've chosen it, but I can't get out of it. Even though it's somehow my fault, I still can't do anything about it. So some kind of sinful behavior, choice, or belief I have that I probably don't even know about, but I did that and it's my fault. And I'm also really unworthy and rejected of God. Yes, God loves his children. Yes, Jesus died for his children, but not me. This is its own kind of warped form of pride, I hope you can see. And that's why these are cousins. These aren't actually diametrically opposite things. There's roots of the other in each extreme. Here's one that I so disagree with now, but I did believe this for a time, that having homosexual feelings are worse than heterosexual sexual feelings. And same thing with behavior, right? It's one thing if a guy and a girl, teenagers get frisky, but if two guys do, that's worse. And even though I don't really know how to solve it or fix it in the shame model, if you just work hard enough or fast and pray enough, read your scriptures enough, God will take this away. And the fact that hasn't happened yet is your fault. Again, I'm speaking out of the shame model. I'm not saying I believe this, but this is what the shame model says, right? So you just haven't worked hard enough. That's probably because you're a bad person. And because you're a bad person, you really don't belong in church until you can fix this about yourself. Once you've gotten rid of these feelings, once you're heterosexual, then you can participate in the church. Yes, there's other people, they have their sins, but their sins aren't as bad as mine in this model. And so I have to fix my feelings, and then I can belong, then I can fit in. And there's experts, therapists, church leaders, they have answers for me. And if I can just find that right expert, that right person, that'll fix me. I think of a friend of mine who once had an opportunity after Elder Bednar was speaking in a place he was at, some ward. And he went up after and disclosed to Elder Bednar about his same-sex attraction as he described it. And he was asking Elder Bednar for some unique insights into what he should do about it. And my friend was kind of disappointed that Elder Bednar didn't really have anything uniquely helpful to say. Elder Bednar was not mean or anything. He was encouraging and loving, but he didn't give my friend the answer, right? And there is a kind of codependency that you can see in people that have this model, that somebody's going to fix me. Somebody's going to give me the answer. Somebody's going to give me the 5 steps. If I do those, I'll do it. But it's somebody else again, that locus of control, that's going to give me the answer. Now, all that said, I think church leaders and even therapists and other experts can help us. But to totally give over that locus of control to somebody else, I think is not very healthy. And that's aspect here. And let's just talk about the disease model. The disease model came about, it started in the late 1800s. It really took root with Freud and then some of the early therapists and this is where conversion therapy came from and other therapies, where we said, well, and it was meant to be compassionate, right? Instead of you being a bad person, you just have a disease, and we're going to cure that disease. But it still elevates expertise and says something needs to be fixed, when in fact, the restoration model says something different. Now, there's a heresy at both of these extremes that I think is really interesting. Both people in the shame-identified world and in the pride identified world combine behavior with feelings. If you feel that way, you basically are it. So if you're in the pride identified model, you say, if you have these feelings, it's harmful not to act on them. And in fact, it's inevitable. You eventually will. You can't help it. You really can't help it. It's just a matter of time. You'll hear people say, if you're gay, just be gay. And what they mean by being gay is having same-sex sexual relationships. And now compare and contrast with the shame identified who say having the feelings is just as bad as acting on them. And you'll be worthy and acceptable once you no longer have these feelings. It doesn't matter whether you've done something. Just having the feelings makes you fundamentally and uniquely bad. So I think that's really interesting. Now, there are elements of truth in both of these aspects. Coming from, reminiscent of the shame model, we can control our behavior. We know this because otherwise things like sexual assault wouldn't be illegal. We recognize that people can control their behavior. And it's also true that the choices in how we think, what we think about, what we do, what our behavior is, does influence our circumstances. And furthermore, we can choose how to respond to things. And that crucially, which we keep hammering on in this series, how we think about our identity, how we think about our circumstances, how we think about our attractions really can change our lives in really meaningful ways. It's not going to turn you straight. So all of a sudden you're aroused by the opposite sex when you were aroused by the same sex necessarily. But the change that this will bring about, in my opinion, I'm going to submit, is even better and more fundamental and more important. And that is almost a distraction to be wanting to become straight or whatever. What we want to do is have this transformation, this restoration, a healed and restored sexuality. And God's purposes can be fulfilled through this experience of sexuality that you're having as a sexual minority, or really anyone, through bridling them, through channeling them in ways in which the Lord has defined, according to his design, can bring joy to ourselves and others. But suppressing them, hiding them, shame, that really isn't helpful. As some of you know, I'm a part-time therapist, and I've also worked with people for years. Sometimes people will come to me and they'll only want to talk to me. And they don't want to tell anybody else, and they just want to fix this. They just want to get rid of it and move on. But I really believe the Lord works out of a growth model rather than a surgery model, right? Surgery, we're going to cut this out. Growth model says, no, we're going to grow into something. And therefore that allows experiences to change and transform us through lives. And the humility and gratitude is so key, because it allows the Lord to really do that in his own time and place. There's always going to be a righteous root desire in whatever behavior we're tempted to do. C.S. Lewis said, the torture allotted to the Danaids in the classical underworld of Dante's Inferno, which was attempting to fill sieves with water, right? Imagine taking a colander and just pouring water in it. You never will be able to. And he says that's a symbol of not one vice, but all vices. And that is sin, right? It is by nature insatiable. But whatever that need it is seeking to meet is probably healthy and good. And so we can look for those righteous roots. And that means I just don't know that I believe anybody's fundamentally bad. And two examples I love to take from the scriptures are Paul and Alma the Younger. If we look at Paul and say, well, what really changed when he had his incredible encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus? Paul beforehand was persecuting Christians, and he was holding the coat of when they were even killing Christians. And so in one sense, everything changed because he stopped from persecuting Christians to trying to make lots more of them. But on the other hand, look at what stayed the same. Paul was still very zealous. He still loved the Lord and the law. He still had this incredible zeal and energy. So on another sense, while a lot changed with Saul into Paul, very little of his fundamental characteristics of his personality changed. They were just directed in a different place. Alma the Younger, he's flattering people away from the church and leading them away, and very effectively, right? He's very convincing, very persuasive. And then I've studied some of the literary structures and poetry and other Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon. And it's interesting, just this is my impression, I could be wrong, but it seems to me at least half of those are in Alma. Alma the younger had a way with words, and he kept that way with words. But instead of using it to lead people away from God, he turned, after his experience with the angel and his 3 days of torment, he changed his allegiance and turned those talents and gifts and abilities to helping bring people in. And those same persuasive ability with words was turned to God's purposes. And I would just say that whatever it is we're dealing with, God can do the same with us.
And when you say a growth approach that Christ takes to our lives, I think it's interesting. When you say look for the righteous root or desire in the behavior, it will always be there. Imagine if every time you have a temptation to sin, instead of saying, I have this temptation because I'm rotten, because I'm bad, because I'm evil, or part of me is evil. Imagine if every time you felt that temptation, you said, part of me is in need of development and growth.
Yeah.
And I can work with God on that development and growth. Mm-hmm. Imagine if you made that shift and said, there's something righteous in here that just needs to come to fruition.
Yeah.
Instead of saying I'm bad, right?
And just asking that question, when I feel that, inside, Dan, I feel like I'm coming out of that false binary, right? Yep. And that's what we're saying. There's a higher and holier way. I really don't blame people for picking pride over shame. It's certainly less personally miserable. But what we're going to do with the rest of this is we're going to look at two contraries. We're going to show examples from all kinds of areas of sexuality and things that people experience around this. And we're going to have the pride model contrasted with the sin, shame, disease model. And then we're going to show what the restoration model says. And it's always incorporates elements from both of them, but in a higher and holier way. And so by looking at these contraries, we'll find a truth that's not between, but above them. So let's look at our first example. We've harped a lot in our first part one of this series on LGBT plus identity and orientation. So in the pride embrace model, what it says about that identity and orientation, and they're equated. And if you remember prior series, I do not equate them, but the pride embrace model does. So it says from a LDS perspective, it says my intelligence, which is like the fundamental building blocks of my spirit, was created gay. And by created gay, I mean created to be incapable of joyful union with an opposite gendered spirit or intelligence. And that was true in the premortal realm, and it will be true in the eternities. And if you remember, we talked about some of the science. That's a rather extraordinary claim to make, since there's actually very little evidence that we're born this way. There's a number of factors, and they're probably unique to each individual. Though it does make sense. This comes from a rooted place of most sexual minorities will say, I've felt this way as long as I can remember. So they have that narrative. And that's where this is just a logical extension into the past and the future. So sexual identity is something to embrace and celebrate and center my identity on. Now, the sin, shame, disease model says, no, this is something I have to overcome right away, as fast as possible. I can't stand another minute of this. And we're going to resist, oppose, or hide this in hopes it'll get smaller. But it's kind of like the horror movies. If you ever watch scary movies, the bug-eyed monster, we'll see him like flash by the screen, and we see him in the dark, and he's really scary. And after, the movie is gone for a while, you see that bug-eyed monster, and he's still ugly, but he's just not as scary. By the end of the movie, it's just not as scary once you get a big look at it. So this doesn't work, but And again, I don't want to be language police here because I have people, friends of mine who identify as ex-gay, and I don't want to act like the language police, but it seems to me that that is an inherently unstable identity because you're defining yourself by what you're not. It seems to invite conflict and codependence. Like if you're ex-gay, you almost need a gay to define yourself against. So I don't identify as gay or ex-gay for reasons that are explained right here. That in the restoration model, this is an aspect of my nature. I've had it maybe as long as I can remember, and I could have it for longer. I don't know. This goes back to the humility we talked about, Dan. There's a humility in our circumstance too, to say, I don't know how long this will last. And Dan, we've talked about the second arrow. Do you want to talk about how the second arrow is particularly harmful?
Yeah. So the Buddhist principle of the second arrow is adversity in life. It's like you're kind of walking along and you get struck with an arrow and you don't know where it came from and it hits you. And
it hurts.
Yeah. And it hurts. And instead of pulling it out and fixing the wound and working on the wound, you start telling stories about how unfair it is and how, somebody hates me or I deserved this. And you come up and you just ruminate and you get these narratives and narratives. And Buddhist teachers say that those narratives that we create of that experience are like sticking ourselves with a second arrow. And so we're
wounding ourselves.
Yeah, we still have the first arrow in. And now we are sticking ourselves with the second arrow with all these narratives and these things that actually don't help us in any way. So we need to pay attention to the narratives of our experiences.
Yes. And we can make it worse, right? Suffering's inevitable, but some suffering's unnecessary is what your story says. And to say, I want to suggest, to say that I will always feel this way or that I will never be able to be married to the opposite sex is a second arrow that we just can't. How can we really know that? Right? Our lives here are 72 years. How many millions or billions of years did we live before? And will we live in the future? And yet we can claim with confidence that we know what that will be like. I think it's better to just have the attitude that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did when they got thrown in that fiery furnace. They said, we believe God will deliver us. We have that faith. But if not, we will be saved still. I don't know what will happen to my sexual desires, but maybe they'll change, maybe they won't. But I know if I'm righteous, I know if I focus on my relationship with God, that I can be saved and I can be happy and heaven will be heavenly.
I would just say, Jeff, a clear indicator that you are coming to Christ is that you need less and less of these narratives. Mm-hmm. You need fewer and fewer things explained about life, about the universe and stuff, because you just are able to rest in this present joy of the love of Christ. So anyway, that's a tangent, but I think it's a good one.
And can this not just be, there's a difference, right? There's a root in that celebration, in that joy, that the sexual identity that the pride model wants to embrace and center. The root of that, the righteous root of that is this can be a blessing to me. It can bring glory to myself and God. It truly can. If we submit to God and allow him to do that. And I love the scripture, Master, who did sin? This man or his parents, that he was born blind? This is the man who was born blind. Jesus answered. Again, Jesus refuses to do this error, this false dichotomy. And he says, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, right? Somebody's got to be at fault. Somebody did something wrong for this bad thing to happen. Jesus said, no, we're not going to point a finger there. We're not going to worry about that. The works of God, this man was allowed, this thing was allowed to happen to him so that the works of God should be made manifest in him. And can I suggest this is another heuristic? We can ask it about our sexual desires or about any circumstance we have. How can this bring glory to God? How can the works of God be made manifest through me, through this circumstance that I might feel is unfortunate or difficult or whatever?
So
Yeah.
contrast that heuristic with the one that we see here in this scripture, because these people saw a blind man, and number one, they assumed, oh, God did this to this person.
Right.
That's number one. That's assumption number one. Assumption number two is that
it was because
either the person or somebody else did something wrong. And assumption number three is, okay, now we can just find out who did that wrong thing so we can shame them and hate them or whatever, right? So tell us who to hate.
That's right.
Jesus, tell us who's at fault so we can hate them, right? So Jesus rejects all three. He just doesn't go there.
Right. And I can kind of appreciate what they're wanting to do here, because we kind of crave this simplicity, right? To blame something. Dan, you have this friend who was an athlete who hurt himself, who said, why did God do this to me?
Yep. And I was stunned. And I don't think he was prepared to hear my answer, so I didn't give it. You kind of have to, you got to sense, is somebody prepared to hear, God didn't do that to you? You play sports.
Yeah.
And these things happen in life. Right.
But it is tragic and sad, right? One of my favorite authors, poet Milton, and he goes blind. And how can he write if he goes blind? There are these injustices, and we want to resolve them with some simple answer. We want it wrapped in a bow and blame somebody, God, or parents or sinners or the person himself. When what we need to do is we need to look at it developmentally, that growth mindset. How can this bring glory, and how can this help me grow? Okay, change. How do you even think of that word? It's so interesting to me how people react to this word. Sister Nelson gave a talk some time ago about change, and some sexual minorities I know took offense because they heard her saying, you can change your sexual orientation. I invite you to read her talk and see if you agree. But the defensiveness around change, you'll see in the Pride Embrace model, where they feel like it's unnecessary and unwelcome. God just wants me to be happy. Again, I'm born perfect. God doesn't want me to be alone. God wants me to be happy. And I could never be happy, not even in the next life, being united with the opposite sex. So I don't want to change. If I did change, I'd be miserable. And the change that they're assuming we're talking about is in sexual orientation or sexual desire. And again, this goes back to the essentialism too. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, to say gay people won't be gay anymore in the next life is to commit celestial genocide. Now, contrast this with the sin shame model, which says change is impossible, even though at the same time I must do it. So I have to change, my orientation has to change, my sexuality can and should change in order to enjoy full fellowship in the church. There's a teeny bit of truth in that. There is fluidity. We've talked about that a little bit, but that doesn't always happen to everybody, and it's not necessarily people's fault when it doesn't. But we do want to be open to those happening. But notice in the shame model how that's an imperative. That has to happen in order for me to be complete or happy. That has to change soon. And if I'm failing, it's because I didn't try hard enough. My behavior can be controlled. That's true, but sometimes this turns into white knuckling, and I think we can get to a better place than that. I sometimes compare white knuckling to the emergency brake on your car. You're glad you have it, but if that's what you're using to drive all the time, you've got blinkers and an accelerator and the other brakes, and so look at some of the other things in your toolkit. I remember hearing about a convert to the church who 40 years after he joined the church, he'd quit smoking, and I credit him for that. And somebody asked him if he still craved cigarettes. And he said, yes, every day. And on one hand, I really admire that person's willpower. On the other hand, I feel it's a little tragic because I would like to think we could get to a place with smoking or whatever where, maybe you get a whiff of tobacco and you go, I used to really like that. That used to be part of me, but it shouldn't haunt me. It shouldn't make me feel constantly there. Okay, so the restoration model, it points to this. Change is kind of the one constant we have in mortality. Our cells are being renewed. Everything's changing about us, but growth is optional. So back to that growth model we want to subscribe for. We want to submit, surrender, consecrate instead of suppress or deny or celebrate or revel. We use these phrases, if thou wilt, but if not. Again, that sort of avoiding inflicting ourselves with that second arrow that we have to have something else. There's something called the principle of compensation. And I'll put a link in the notes that you can read if you download the presentation, Come What May and Love It. Talks about how sometimes there are losses that we suffer in this life that we might not have repaired in this life. Elder Worthland talks about his grandson, who is severely autistic, and that's going to limit some of the opportunities that he has on this side of the veil, perhaps. And there are eternal blessings and compensation in the next life, but there is also compensation in this life. And Elder Worthland talks about the great blessings. And if we're humble, and again, we want to see this as an opportunity, we will see the compensatory blessings that come to us in our circumstances. It's the difference between comparing ourselves and recognizing our unique circumstances, unique opportunities, gifts, and blessings that our circumstances present to us. And I just hate this whole dichotomy between straight and gay. Why do you want to trade one form of fallen sexual desire for another? And there can be a false assumption that heterosexuality is somehow inherently more righteous. And I guess it depends on how we define that. But Dan, there are some pretty problematic aspects of heterosexuality, aren't there?
Yes, there are. Absolutely.
So why trade one sexual form of sexual desire for another one that can also lead you away from God, that can also bring yourself and others sorrow? So we're not trying to go from gay to straight. We're not trying to go from sexual to asexual. We're trying to go from a fallen natural man, a fallen natural sexuality, which can manifest in 100 different ways.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I got to tell the story. When I was in one of my young men's advisors in one of our lessons, he shocked us by telling us young men, he said, as soon as, when you get married, you're going to think that your problem of lust towards women is over because you're married. Now you have like one individual and she's going to be the focus for all of your sexual desire. He said, that's not going to be true. You're not going to stop, finding other women attractive because you married one woman. And you're going to have decisions to make about how you respond to your desires. And we were stunned. We were, because all of us thought, oh gosh, we just need to focus on marrying some woman who we're attracted to, and then boom.
And then we don't have to worry about it anymore.
Right. Right. And he said, no, you are still going to find other women attractive. And you're going to have decisions to make about how to respond to that.
And the pride embrace model would say, well, maybe you should have affairs or look at porn.
Of course.
And the sin, disease, shame model would say, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible person because I noticed another woman.
Right. Yep.
And the restoration model would say, how do we redeem that sexuality? Right. Channel that in a place that is healthy and holy and higher.
Right. You don't have to live life, with this constant frustration and anger and stuff. If you understand that, hey, this is part of my present reality is being a man with testosterone in my body, right?
Yeah.
So, you don't have to go to the shame side of things or to the pride side of things. You don't have to go to either one. Just say, this is my present reality. And I'm going to make decisions based on my values and my faith and, my observable reality of how much happiness it brings me to not indulge every thought and desire that I have.
Yeah. Yeah. And I pity any sexual minority who thinks he would be a better person because he had that challenge instead of what he has.
Right.
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 And in the case of sexual minorities, your feelings might, again, we want to be open to this, broaden to enable heterosexual dating and eventually maybe even marriage, which can be something you strive towards. But whether you do or not, you can still be a good person. You can still be a good Latter-day Saint. You can still contribute to the kingdom and be a valuable person. So it's not an essential thing that you have to do. And if you don't do, you're bad, evil, wicked sinner. And we do have choices, as we've harped on over and over again, about how we see ourselves, about how we want to identify. That is under our control. And so how we construct and deconstruct our identity is something we should be thoughtful about, aware of, and not just imbibe without questioning our assumptions and the assumptions of the world. We have control over that.